in an important way, narrative about ourselves is bondage. The thoughts that I was there, I did that, I had those relationships, those particular regrets. In the future, I'm going to do this, have these hopes and dreams, these particular fears, these ambitions, these relationships, right? Past and future in narrative are bondage because they are the thing that constructs the sense of being an individual, doing, experiencing person and entity. Which is not to say that the purpose of this spiritual investigation is to destroy all narrative, per se. Not exactly. It is rather to investigate the narrative and see that in some sense that the narrative itself only exists as a concept of the narrative. That the narrative is itself not something that even exists to be destroyed. That's the nature of it as an illusion. Part of the narrative says that another part of it exists. That part says another part exists. And on it goes, kind of like a mutually reinforcing set of voices. They're all suggesting that the others exist. And they all sort of believe each other because of the others, right? So you sort of knock down the entire structure in a sense by examining it. An examination really consists of two things that are going on. One is discernment. So, what really is going on in the narrative? Well, the narrative is about this person called I. So self-inquiry says, look at that I. And it turns out the I is a very, very interesting part of the narrative illusion because it is, you have the Greek god Janus who is two-faced. The I is a concept on one side. It is false on one side. On the other side, it's reality. So it is sort of this very, very interesting weak point of the narrative illusion, which when examined unravels the illusion. When the I is discerned away from all the things that it is thought to be, which is narrative. Narrative is all the things that the I is thought to be. Then what remains, which can't be spoken, is the truth. And that's how both inquiry and surrender function. Inquiry examines the I directly by chasing the sense of the I. Surrender investigates it a little bit more indirectly, but it's the other side of the coin by moving away from all that is thought. Implicitly, when you move away from all that's thought, you have to ask the question, well, what isn't thought? So there's a kind of negative self-inquiry going on, even in surrender. Or there's a negative surrender going on in self-inquiry, because as you move towards the I, you move away from thought. And so you're forced to discern subtler and subtler instances of what thought is. So there's a discernment element of things, and tightly linked to the discernment element of things, there is a kind of breaking of mental habit, a breaking of mental patterns. This narrative habit, this idea of believing in the narrative, generates desires and actions that keep the mind busy, concentrating on the narrative and perpetuating it. The narrative thrives on being taken seriously and being acted upon, being attended to. So when attention is intensely and continuously diverted away from the usual narrative way of thinking of things, which is to say taking the narrative at face value, and instead is directed towards a task of discernment, it breaks the usual patterns of desire and fear that keep the narrative going, that keep the mind engrossed in the narrative attention pattern, that keep the mind engrossed in that identity that the narrative creates. It's like the magician, right, that wants you to look where the magician wants you to look, and not to examine this other part, which is where the misdirection is going on, right? So the magician will be like, look here, then look here, then look here, and you look this place and that place in a particular order, and it keeps going like that forever. Until and unless you challenge that pattern by starting to not accept the narrative at face value and to divert your attention from the usual narrative to the investigative purpose. The difficulty arises when the narrative, so to say, objects. Because if the narrative is real, if you are a person, if you are doing, if you are experiencing, if you have these relationships, if you have these goals, you have these regrets, you have these desires, you have these fears, right? So on and so forth. Then you're obligated to keep acting, like this puppet. Keep going, like a hamster in a wheel, serving like a slave those narrative desires and fears. If that narrative fantasy is true, then when you pull your attention away from that and attempt to look at the narrative, to discern, the narrative is going to scream at you. Your life's going to go out of control. You're going to lose things that you value. Things are going to end up in the garbage, right? Because you're not putting in the effort to make them go the way that you ought to be. So if the narrative is real, and the narrative is threatening you with all kinds of disaster if you stop running on that little hamster wheel. And this is the great barrier, ultimately, that has to be dealt with. Because from the spiritual standpoint, the reality is you cannot be touched by anything that goes on in the narrative. You are perfect, you are stainless, you are free, you are exempt from effort, you are exempt from result. You cannot be harmed. But between the narrative view of things and the spiritual, quote-unquote, view of things, there exists this seeming wall of fire, which is you have to challenge the narrative and let go. Because otherwise your mind will be continuously processing what the narrative wants you to process and not looking at it, right? You need the continuity of looking at it to see that it's just a narrative, not just intellectually, but experientially, so to say. But the narrative doesn't want you to do that. It wants you to keep processing it and acting on it helplessly. So it will bring up these fears about what will happen if you let go of the narrative, if you dare to move your attention away from all the things that you have to do, all the things that you should be focusing on to be happy for the sake of your loved ones, for the sake of society, or even for your own pleasure, or to avoid something harmful happening to you. I mean, all these things, right? It's going to say really bad things are going to happen if you stop attending to those things. And it's up to the seeker to challenge that. An inquiry to say, to whom are these fears occurring, right? And to redirect attention from those fears to that sense of the experiencer, because those fears are occurring in awareness. What is that awareness? Am I really the one subject to these fears? Well, there's only one way to find out, which is to look at the I. Or in surrender, simply say, what will be, will be. I choose to relax. And that action is a kind of challenge to the narrative storyline. So this is a kind of war between two perspectives. And on the narrative side of the perspective, enormous fear and anxiety is going to come up, which can only be dealt with progressively by confronting those very fears with the tools that they fear. Ignore the fear. Can the fear harm you? The fears are illusion. The wall of fire that the narrative threatens is illusion. It cannot actually singe you, but it seems scary. It seems like you'll lose control of your life. It seems like things will go wrong. The reality is you are not the one in your life. But to see that for yourself and not merely take my word for it, you have to have the courage to investigate even when the voices of the narrative are screaming.